Pharmacotherapy is an integral part of all the medical subjects, guys, especially the clinical ones. And today, we have come up with a session, integrated session of pharmacology with ophthalmology, so that you can have a look at these drugs, pharmacology, from a different perspective with your own eyes. Hello, guys. I'm Dr. Ranjan, your pharmacology faculty at Mero.
Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Utsav Bansal, your ophthalmology faculty at Mero. In this session, me and Dr. Ranjan will be trying to give you a peek into our ophthalmology OPD. What we do in our OPD, we'll listen to the patients, listen carefully for the symptoms and the history. Then see their eyes carefully for all the findings, all the signs. Then based on both, we try to diagnose and ultimately treat to the best of our abilities. This is what is being asked these days. This is what is meant by the clinical scenarios or the clinical integration. And this is what we'll be doing in this session.
So, guys, in this session, we'll be discussing about different cases, right? Clinical cases. And in those cases, we will see how the knowledge of one subject can be integrated with another subject, right? Giving relief to your patients. Let us begin with the first case.
So let's begin with our clinical scenario, question number 1. A 41-year-old man presented to the clinic complaining of an impairment in his ability to voluntarily raise his left eyelid. Physical examination showed miosis, that is constriction of the pupil, ptosis, flushed facial skin, and loss of sweating over the left side of the face. Now, all the clinical scenario questions would ideally be divided into two parts. One making the diagnosis and then the actual question, right? So if we see till this point, the question is enough to be able to help you diagnose. But let us complete the question first. To determine the site of the autonomic lesion, so another clue has been given to you, autonomic lesion. A hydroxyamphetamine solution was instilled into the conjunctival sac, and a few minutes later, mydriasis was noted. So the question is now, the physician correctly concluded that there was a localized lesion, localization of lesion, in which of the following nervous structures? Okay, guys. So this is the question. Whatever I have underlined or circled, these are the important points that you can take home. This is what is needed in every long stem question. There will be a lot of information, but your eyes need to be working like Sherlock Holmes, right? You need to be able to pick up those important words in the question, right? So let's see the question. The first important point here is meiosis is there, ptosis is there, and loss of sweating is there. Loss of sweating, loss of fluid, and hydrosis. So if I see, I'm getting three things here: meiosis, ptosis, and I can say anhydrosis. Now, as soon as you hear these three words, what do you think of? Before I go on to the diagnosis, before I explain you, can you think of the diagnosis? Has this been sufficient? If not, then focus on the word autonomic. It has something to do with autonomic. Autonomic means either sympathetic or parasympathetic. See, I've given you the clue: sympathetic or parasympathetic, meiosis, anhydrosis, ptosis. Yes, guys. I hope all of you have been able to arrive at the diagnosis. The diagnosis is Horner's syndrome. Right, guys? So what is Horner syndrome? Horner syndrome is oculosympathetic palsy. Palsy of the sympathetic supply to the eye. Yes? And what are the clinical features it presents with? HI. H for heterochromia iridis. Hetero means different, chromia means color, iridis means iris. So both the iris will be of different color. I for inferior eyelid elevation. The inferior eyelid will be elevated up. Then the more common features: MAPLE. M for meiosis, constriction of pupil. A for anhydrosis, loss of sweating over the face, as we saw in the question. P for ptosis, drooping of upper eyelid, or as was mentioned, inability to voluntarily lift his eyelid up. L for loss of ciliospinal reflex, and lastly E for inophthalmos or sunken eyeball. I hope the diagnosis and the clinical features everybody is remembering. Horner syndrome is a very important clinical scenario, or otherwise a topic also. Now, what we need to know in order to be able to solve this question is what is the sympathetic pathway, the supply, what is the pathway. So our pathway starts from hypothalamus, everybody. From hypothalamus, the nerve supplies comes to the spinal cord, C8 to T1, which is also called as ciliospinal bulge. So this part is known as the first order neuron or the central pathway. Then From the spinal cord, everybody, the nerve fibers will cross over the lung parenchyma on both sides. So from posterior, they are coming anteriorly over the lung parenchyma, and then they are synapsing in the neck. That is what you see. From posterior, they are going anteriorly, and then they are synapsing into this ganglion in the neck. This is the superior cervical ganglion. So this is the second order neuron, everybody, and this is the preganglionic part. This is important to remember that they cross over the lung parenchyma, because from here a surgical question is asked, a clinical question is asked. Pancoast tumor, a tumor of the lung parenchyma. While we are resecting Pancoast tumor, sometimes we inadvertently end up damaging the sympathetic fibers, and thus it leads to Horner syndrome. So anatomy can lead to the diagnosis, right? Now, after they have relayed into the neck, they will travel into the eye to supply the dilator pupillae muscle via the long ciliary nerve. So the last part is known as the third order neuron or the postganglionic neuron. Now, with this sufficient information, now we should be able to understand how to diagnose and how does the diagnosis work by using hydroxyamphetamine. Dr. Ranjan?
I'll talk here about diagnosis, and I'll talk about how to find the lesion. Is it in the post-ganglionic segment or the pre-ganglionic segment, right? So to make you understand that, I have drawn a diagram here, and you can see the diagram here. You have the first order neuron, and here we have the second order neuron, then we have the third order neuron, which is the post-ganglionic segment. Now remember guys, first our aim is to make a diagnosis if at all we are dealing with Horner syndrome. I'm not taking into account the location. Is it post-ganglionic or is it pre-ganglionic, right? Location is not the question. So it can be anywhere. It can be involvement of either the central neuron or the pre-ganglionic neuron or the post-ganglionic neuron. In all these three cases, there are two drugs which are used for diagnosis. So mind it, I'll be able to tell that the patient is suffering from Horner syndrome, but I would not be able to tell is the location, is it preganglionic, central, or is it post-ganglionic. So guys, we use two drugs, cocaine and apracnolidine, and both of them, they have different mechanisms by which we come to a conclusion that it is Horner syndrome. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about the way this first, second, third order neuron, they work. Now, you know guys, an action potential would be generated in the hypothalamus, which will travel all the way to the spinal cord, where it will depolarize the second order neuron. It will regenerate action potential. It will be propagated forward. And in that case, in the ganglion, again, this action potential is regenerated. And when it reaches to the synapse, that is between an axon from this ganglion and a muscle, then in this synapse, guys, what is released? Remember, in sympathetic, this is sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system, post-ganglionic segment, the neurotransmitter has to be norepinephrine. So this norepinephrine is released, and now this norepinephrine, it undergoes something called as reuptake. Now guys, try to understand. When norepinephrine is released, it is going to act upon alpha-1 receptors present on the eye muscles, that is your radial muscles of iris, isn't it? And because of which alpha-1, their GQ subtype, calcium increases, they will contract and pupil dilates, or in other words, what is seen as mydriasis. So this will happen only if this pathway is intact. Mind it, anywhere this pathway is impacted, let us say this pathway has been hampered here or here or here, does not matter where. In all of these cases, norepinephrine would not be released anywhere the lesion is, and there is a decreased norepinephrine, and because of which alpha-1 receptors are not stimulated, and because of which mydriasis is not seen. And that is the reason why what would be seen in a patient of Horner syndrome is meiosis, irrespective of where the lesion is. Now what I'm saying is, I'm using cocaine to diagnose if it is a case of Horner syndrome. Now usually what cocaine does, cocaine inhibits reuptake of norepinephrine. Now mind it guys, it would inhibit reuptake of norepinephrine, thus increase norepinephrine in the synapse, and should be able to produce mydriasis in normal cases, isn't it? But in this case, because there is a block either here or here or here, because of that, there is no norepinephrine in the synapse. And if there is no norepinephrine, there is nothing to undergo reuptake, which means what? Cocaine, if I give here, will not increase norepinephrine. And that is the reason why there is no mydriasis. So if I give cocaine and the meiosis that is seen here, it does not improve, then it confirms that it is a case of Horner syndrome. Mind you, again, I don't know the location. I'll find the location in a short while. Guys, clinically, cocaine is not that commonly used, isn't it, Dr.
No, sir, it is absolutely not used.
So, yeah, so mostly what is more commonly used is
Clonidine.
Guys, how apraclonidine is used? Now, this is where pure pharmacology comes in, and you need to understand how apraclonidine is given in this case and how it will diagnose Horner syndrome. Now, usually, what we know is apraclonidine, normally, it is an alpha-2 agonist. And alpha-2 agonism, usually what it does, by acting upon the presynaptic alpha-2, which are GI subtype, it decreases norepinephrine. So usually, in a normal case, it should produce meiosis. Mind it, I'm saying in a normal case. But in case of Horner syndrome, what happens? In this case, see, we just now discussed in Horner syndrome, when there is a lesion, there is a decrease in norepinephrine, isn't it? If you remember, there is a decrease in norepinephrine. A chronic decrease in norepinephrine in the synapse, what does it cause? It causes this alpha-1 receptor to upregulate. So there is a mushrooming of alpha-1 receptor here. So there is something called as alpha-1 upregulation. And you know that your drugs like apraclonidine, we say it is alpha-2 agonist, but in truth, it is an agonist at both alpha-1 and alpha-2, right? It is not that selective. And because of this alpha-1 upregulation, apraclonidine will now bind to alpha-1 receptor and produce mydriasis. So, in a patient of Horner syndrome, when you give apraclonidine, right, your meiotic pupil, it undergoes mydriasis. So, that confirms the diagnosis of Horner syndrome. Now, guys, either cocaine or apraclonidine, I have confirmed the diagnosis. Now, I would like to know, where is the location? To know the location, is the location central or preganglionic, or is the location postganglionic? For that, I'm going to use a drug called as amphetamine 1%. Now, guys, you know, how does amphetamine act? First of all, to be clear about this, amphetamine is a drug which acts by displacement, isn't it? Amphetamine is a drug which acts by displacement. So, amphetamine enters into the postganglionic neuron, and from here, it forces norepinephrine out, and this norepinephrine will bind to alpha-1 receptors, which means what? Amphetamine as a drug would be effective only if this postganglionic segment is normal, or in other words, there is no lesion. So just imagine I give amphetamine and the patient produces mydriasis. Mydriasis is seen on giving amphetamine. Then in that case, where the lesion should be located, either central, preganglionic, or postganglionic. Obviously, guys, the lesion has to be central or preganglionic, isn't it, sir? Right. So if mydriasis is seen, that means this segment is normal. This segment is normal. So lesion is in central or preganglionic. If there is no mydriasis, in that case, that means what? Where is the lesion seen? The lesion is in the postganglionic system, right? So mydriasis. So what we can conclude is, if mydriasis is seen, then the lesion is either central or preganglionic. If there is no mydriasis, in that case, the lesion is postganglionic. So this is how, guys, we can make a diagnosis by using amphetamine, and this is what our question has asked, right? So now let us go back to our question. And what does the question say? Hydroxyamphetamine solution was instilled into the conjunctival sac of the left eye. A few minutes later, mydriasis was observed. Now, if mydriasis was observed, that means what? In this case, what is the lesion? What do you think, guys? The lesion is obviously it is not in the postganglionic, isn't it? Because otherwise norepinephrine would not be released. So lesion is preganglionic sympathetic nerves innervating the face, right? So guys, this is our first question, and as you can see, Horner syndrome, we have discussed the clinical aspect as well as the pharmacological aspect is little bit complicated. We have both tried to explain to you to the best of our abilities, the complete course of Horner syndrome. So guys, sir, I'd like you to take over for the next question.
Beautifully explained. This is an important clinical scenario, sir, because in my previous experience, a lot of students get confused on this. So I hope now your confusion will be solved, guys, everybody.
Yeah, great.
Okay, sir. So let's move on to our clinical scenario question number 2. Guys, a 27-year-old woman was brought to the emergency. So first of all, let's again note the age, 27. Was brought to the emergency with complaints of severe ocular pain, redness, colored halos, and hazy vision or blurred vision. Now again, as soon as you are reading all these symptoms, the diagnosis or the differential diagnosis at least should start to form in your mind. Redness, pain, colored halos, right? Now, there was inflammation in the anterior chamber and also the IOP was 48 mmHg. What is the normal IOP, everybody? I hope we remember that. The normal IOP should be less than 21. So the IOP is more than doubled. IOP is severely, highly raised. Now, a diagnosis was made. I hope you have been able to make the diagnosis. And 2 drugs were given. I don't know which drugs. And another drug was given as an eye drop after 15 minutes. So first 2 drugs and then 1 more drug followed by that. So the question asks, which of the following 3 drugs were most likely administered? So basically the treatment is being asked. But for the treatment, again, we have to get to know the diagnosis first. So what is the diagnosis? IOP is raised, guys. IOP is raised. IOP is very high raised. So if IOP is raised, what is the first thing that you think of, guys? Obviously, we think of glaucoma, everybody. Yes? Now, glaucoma is of 2 types, open angle and angle closure. Now, whether it is open angle or angle closure, everybody. Let's again look at all the symptoms, pain, redness, colored halos, blurring of vision. Blurring of vision, does it occur in all types of glaucoma? Or does it occur only in open angle or does it occur only in angle closure? Think about it. Also think about the fact that pain, redness, all these are acute symptoms. They are not chronic symptoms. So if you know the basics of glaucoma, you should know that open angle glaucoma by virtue is a chronic disease. Whereas angle closure glaucoma by virtue is an acute condition. So the question is giving you ample information to be able to clearly diagnose that it is a case of acute congestive glaucoma or acute angle closure glaucoma, right? Now, what are the symptoms seen in a case of acute angle closure glaucoma? I hope all of you remember. Let's see this photograph. There is extreme headache. Then there is severe eye pain. Why is there severe eye pain, everybody? Because of the severely high IOP. When the IOP is raised, all the pressure is pushing all the structures of the eyeball out. All the nerves, all the neurons are being stretched, and that is why it is leading to severe ocular pain. Now, because of the raised IOP, what else is occurring? If we remember, the IOP is breaking the corneal endothelium from inside, the tight junctions. That is why the aqueous is able to enter into the cornea. And when the cornea will have fluid, we will call it corneal edema. When there is corneal edema, the cornea will lose its transparency. That means the cornea will become hazy. And as soon as the cornea becomes hazy, the patient will start to complain of distorted vision. Such a thing will not occur in open angle glaucoma because in open angle glaucoma, we do not see such high levels of IOP. So there is nothing called corneal edema. There is nothing called diminution of vision or haziness of vision. This same corneal edema, think of it as water droplets in the cornea. What occurs when light falls onto water droplets? Prismatic dispersion into a rainbow. The same thing is going to occur in your eye. As soon as light falls onto the edematous cornea, the light is going to split into colors. And what you are able to see are colored halos or halos around light. Along with this, you also see redness and vomiting. Right, guys? So I hope the question is clear enough. If we want to revise angle closure glaucoma a little more, I hope we remember that on Torchlight in our 3rd year postings, guys, we are asked to see or asked to differentiate between open angle glaucoma and angle closure glaucoma. We throw light from the temporal side. If it crosses throughout the anterior chamber, it is open angle glaucoma. But if there is a shadow over the nasal iris, it is called as eclipse sign, and that is diagnostic of angle closure glaucoma. Also, synechia are seen. Synechia between iris and lens, synechia between iris and cornea, anterior and posterior both. And a cataract is seen in angle closure glaucoma, which is known as glaucoma flecken. Right, guys? Now, with this knowledge, let's go back to the question. The question is asking you the drugs administered. And now, over to Dr. Ranjan.
So guys, as far as treatment of an acute attack of congestive glaucoma is concerned, right, so acute congestive glaucoma, see guys, our first aim in the beginning is to reduce the IOP as soon as possible, as much as possible to normalize this as fast as possible. So we need very potent drugs which can decrease intraocular pressure. In other words, we need to use systemic drugs, right? And two of them which are commonly used are mannitol and acetazolamide. Intravenous mannitol, in India we use oral acetazolamide because parenteral formulation is not available. I use mannitol or acetazolamide. If both are an option, mannitol would be a better answer. Once IOP is normalized, I will start with a miotic agent, and the only miotic agent that is clinically used nowadays is pilocarpine, the preferred one, right? And I use pilocarpine so that the pupil does not dilate again, there is no mydriasis again, and there is not another attack of closed angle glaucoma. Now guys, some of you might think, why do start with mannitol or acetazolamide? Why not start with pilocarpine? Guys, in acute congestive glaucoma, the IOP is so high and your iris, it is under so much of tension, right? So pilocarpine would not be able to act upon a muscle that is highly tensed due to pressure, right? So we need to relax that first of all by decreasing IOP. Then I'll give pilocarpine, and until the surgery is done for the patient, to keep the IOP on the lower side, we start usually the patient on another drug, that is timolol. The timolol is preferred here. Now, sir, why don't we use, overall we know that prostaglandin analogs are the drug of choice in glaucoma open angle, isn't it? So why is it not in this case?
So we can use latanoprost, but we usually don't, because as was also mentioned in the question and as is clinically seen, in every episode of angle closure glaucoma, secondary to 100%, primary also a lot of cases, there is some sort of anterior chamber inflammation also seen. And all of us students know that latanoprost can increase inflammation, it can lead to uveitis. So a case which has chances of inflammation already, we do not want to give latanoprost. So we like to give timolol, though it is not an absolute contraindication not to give latanoprost. So timolol is the better drug to keep the IOP controlled till we are able to carry out the treatment of choice. Sir, because we cannot maintain the patient, as I hope all the students understand, lifelong on acetazolamide or pilocarpine. Yeah. So we need to be able to carry out a treatment of choice, and that is what laser iridotomy. The basic problem in angle closure glaucoma is that the aqueous is not able to flow from PC to AC. So we need to create another hole in the iris to allow the aqueous to travel from posterior chamber to anterior chamber.
All right. So and after the surgery, our patient can be basically off drugs, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Slowly. That is the basic use of the surgery. Okay. So to make the patient lifelong free from any anti-glaucoma drugs.
Great. So guys, glaucoma is a very important topic, and an MCQ is invariably asked every other year from the topic of glaucoma, and it is the most important topic of convergence from pharmacology and ophthalmology. So what we'll do here with sir, that we'll discuss the drugs, which are different drugs which are used in glaucoma. I'll give my perspective, we'll give his perspective, right? So let's begin with the most commonly used drug or the drugs of choice in open angle glaucoma. So open angle glaucoma, guys, prostaglandin analogs like latanoprost or bimatoprost, they're the drug of choice in open angle glaucoma. And mechanism of action, they commonly ask. The MCQs are mostly on the drug of choice, mechanism of action, or side effects. Now, mechanism of action is an increase in evioscleral outflow. So, Dr. Usab, I would like to ask you, what is that property which makes them better as compared to beta blockers or alpha 2 agonists, so that they are now the drug of choice, at least beta blockers?
So very good question, sir. So, a lot of students who have not updated their knowledge, they still come to me and ask, sir, isn't timolol the drug of choice? So, yes, guys, timolol used to be the drug of choice 10 years back. But what is the problem? Why has it been shifted to latanoprost? So the main problem with timolol was that as it is an anti-glaucoma drug and the drug needs to be given for a long period, 10, 15, 20 years maybe, right? So a lot of patients were not compliant with the dosing. What was the dosing of timolol? What is the dosing? It is BD, twice a day. So a lot of cases were lost to compliance because of not being able to put the eye drop 2 times regularly. That is where latanoprost came in. Latanoprost had the same efficacy as far as reduction of IOP and control of glaucoma was concerned, with the advantage of having only OD or once daily dosing. And that was one of the important reasons why latanoprost superseded timolol and became the drug of choice. The compliance became much better.
Great. So, side effects, guys, as you can see, iris pigmentation can be seen. So iris pigmentation or heterochromia iridis. how much of this is a problem for visual acuity, or how much is this a problem for social stigma?
Sir, visual acuity, no problem.
No problem, right?
It is actually what you said, social stigma, because it is a cosmetic problem. Cosmetic problem, that too not in us, sir, not in Asians, sir, because we already have brown iris, sir.
Yeah.
So no problem. This is a cosmetic problem, and actually the Westerners.
West, right?
Why, sir? Because they have blue colored iris, grey colored iris. On long term latanoprost use in one eye, one of the iris will become very dark in color. So now you have a funny photograph, one dark iris, one light iris. So an absolute social stigma, cosmetic problem, sir.
So you are a mutant, basically. So second side effect, guys, sir, trichomegaly is a side effect. That is overgrowth of the eyelashes, and those eyelashes can also enter into the eye and cause irritation to the
Right, sir.
cornea.
I hope all our students will know here that this is something same as trichiasis. Trichiasis is inward turning of eyelashes. Here, actually, trichiasis is not occurring, but because of the overgrowth of eyelashes, a lot of eyelashes can turn in and lead to the same problem that trichiasis does. That is, it will rub on the cornea and ultimately may even lead to corneal opacity. But even though, sir, this can be a problem in the eye for a patient like me, sir, it is very helpful, sir. Sir, actually, bimatoprost is FDA approved, sir, for regrowth of hair, sir. So I can help myself, sir.
Hypotrichosis.
Sir.
For hypotrichosis.
Right, sir, absolutely.
All right, sir. And dry and sandy eyes. Dry and sandy eyes, it can be seen, guys. It is asked as an MCQ. So, but I would like to know the clinical perspective. I mean, how common is this side effect? I mean,
So, sir, actually, dry and sandy eyes should not be attributed straight away to latanoprost per se. It is actually a side effect due to the preservative in the eye drops, sir.
okay.
But these days, the companies have come up with preservative-free formulations, so we very rarely see dry and sandy eyes specifically due to latanoprost, sir. So, as a side effect, I won't consider it much important, or I won't be bothered about it.
Okay, means today no patient comes to you
No,
with
sir.
this side.
No,
Anyway, so this is for historical perspective. And as the last one, cystomacular edema. So, Dr. Utsav, we know that diabetes can also cause cystomacular
Absolutely,
edema. So, if suppose a patient of diabetes comes to you with glaucoma, take the history. So, do you avoid prostaglandin analogs?
Absolutely, sir. This is a very, very, very important clinical point, sir. Sir, when we are working as clinicians, we cannot only rely on our theoretical knowledge. We need to be aware of all the important factors. That's what I said in the beginning, sir. It is very important to listen to the patient, listen to the history of the patient and the symptoms of the patient. So if my glaucoma patient is a diabetic also, I know that diabetes can lead to cystoid macular edema, and I know latanoprost can also lead to cystoid macular edema. So I will never ever try and give latanoprost in a diabetic patient. I will always try and avoid it. I will rather go on to timolol. Timolol was the drug of choice. It is not an inferior drug, it is an equal drug, just the problem of compliance. So we need to be aware of the contraindications and the disease relations also. So just like, sir, you have written here that it is contraindicated in uveitis. So as we just said, latanoprost can cause inflammation. So if a patient is already uveitic glaucoma due to herpes or any other disease, we can never ever think of using latanoprost. So we have to aware of such clinical scenarios. As students, we have to pick these words in the questions. And as clinicians, we have to be aware in our OPDs about the same thing, sir.
Great, sir. And guys, contraindication, prostaglandins, they are pro-inflammatory. Means they themselves cause inflammation. So contraindication is not that difficult, guys. Anything that has to do with itis, keratitis, uveitis, they will further fuel this inflammation and worsen it. And these are also important questions, guys, they do ask you. Now coming to the second class of drug, guys, beta blockers. But before I move on to beta blockers, I would like to point one important thing here, that in glaucoma, any drug which has anything to do with sympathetic nervous system, be it beta blockers, be it epinephrine, dipivefrin, or be it alpha-2 agonist, in all these cases, they have one common mechanism of action, that is a decreased aqueous production. Right? That is primary mechanism, though epinephrine and alpha-2 agonist, they also increase uveoscleral outflow. There's a secondary mechanism, right? And the use of these drugs, guys, all of them, they're used in open-angle glaucoma, and beta blockers, they are second-line drugs in open-angle glaucoma. Now, sir, as you can see, we have a lot of list of beta blockers which are available for glaucoma. Which one do you prefer, or which one is most commonly used?
Sir, hands down timolol, sir.
Timolol.
Hands down, sir.
All right. So guys, timolol, the benefit is more because it's a cardioselective beta blocker, and when a patient of glaucoma comes, it might be possible he's on multiple drugs. Nevertheless, guys, whenever the patient is on one beta blocker, we should avoid any other systemic beta blocker, because both can block AV node and that can be problematic for the patient. There could be bradyarrhythmia and other side effects. Now, as side effects, timolol causes NLD obstruction. This has been asked once, nasolacrimal duct obstruction. Now, sir, timolol causing NLD, how common a problem is this?
So not very common, sir. Very frankly, not very common. We do come across such cases, but very rarely. So even though it is a textbook side effect, we say, but clinically, okay, sir.
I mean, it's not that big a headache for you
Exactly,
as a
sir.
clinician, isn't it? All right.
Clinically, sir, timolol, we actually, if we see a patient who is on long-term timolol usage, the most common side effect we end up seeing is corneal anesthesia. Timolol, somewhere, yes, sir, long term. So let's say patient is 10 years on timolol, we end up seeing corneal anesthesia, and corneal anesthesia leads to exposure keratitis or exposure keratopathy.
So you mean to say, if a patient is for too many years, let's say 5, 6, or 7 years, so should an ophthalmologist be thinking about switching onto some other drugs?
Sir, yes, obviously. So if we have the correct history of the patient, then we are able to foresee what kind of chronic side effects can occur from a drug.
Okay.
And also it is usually seen that a single drug is not able to maintain the intraocular pressure for a very long time.
Okay.
So anyways, bitherapy and then multitherapy is usually clinically needed, sir.
All right, great. So that's great insight. Guys, epinephrine, dipivefrin, these are not that commonly used nowadays, isn't it, sir?
No, sir, not at all, sir. Not at all,
right?
No, clinically.
So they can cause ocular allergy, black pigmentation of conjunctiva can be seen because epinephrine can get converted into melanin because the primary source of melanin is tyrosine. Now, alpha-2 agonists, guys, they are commonly asked, and alpha-2 agonists, apraclonidine, brimonidine. So, Dr. Utsav, I would like to ask you, in today's clinical scenario, how commonly are they used in glaucoma?
Sir, not very commonly used as far as primary open-angle glaucoma is concerned as monotherapy. As bitherapy, yes, along with timolol, brimonidine is used, a lot of combinations come.
Okay.
But apraclonidine has an actual specific use apart from primary open-angle glaucomas.
All right.
So, sir, apraclonidine we usually use post-laser. So, as we just talked about angle closure glaucoma, the treatment of choice is laser iridotomy. So, whenever we are doing any laser in the eye, the laser is basically a beam of energy. So, a lot of energy is being dispersed in all the structures of the eye. So, a lot of energy is being dispersed in aqueous also, which leads to raised IOP after every laser procedure. Okay. So, when we are doing a laser, we need to be mindful of this fact and control the IOP post-laser. So, for post-laser IOP control, apraclonidine is the drug of choice. We should try and prescribe apraclonidine in all post-laser procedures.
Great. So, guys, these are the use Dr. Utsav has explained beautifully. Now, coming to side effects, guys, side effects are very important. N number of times they have asked about the side effects. Now, if I talk about side effects of apraclonidine, now remember A for apraclonidine and A for alpha-1. Now, guys, remember apraclonidine, though it is alpha-2 agonist, it is as good as alpha-2 agonist is also alpha-1 agonist, right? So, you know that selectivity is something which is relative, not absolute in pharma. So, these side effects are because of alpha-1 agonism. So, if I stimulate alpha-1 receptors in your eyelids, alpha-1 is GQ subtype of receptor. It would increase calcium lid contraction and lid retraction would be seen. Similarly, radial muscles of iris, alpha-1 contraction, mydriasis. Conjunctival blanching because blood vessel, alpha-1 vasoconstriction, blanching is seen. Brimonidine. Now, brimonidine, remember, B for brimonidine, B for blood-brain barrier. Brimonidine crosses blood-brain barrier and has central depressive side effect like apnea in neonates. It has been asked a lot of times. Drowsiness or somnolence and hypotension because of central sympatholytic effect. So, sir, I would like to ask you here, drowsiness or somnolence. So, if a driver comes to you or a pilot comes to you, then should we not be thinking about brimonidine in that case?
Sir, very frankly, brimonidine, as I said, is never considered as a first-line therapy anyways in POAG.
Okay.
Even if we are giving it as a part of dual therapy.
Okay.
But in dual therapy, we have the advantage of having various combinations. Timolol with brimonidine, timolol with brinzolamide. Okay. So, if we are certain of the patient's profile, then yes, we try to avoid it.
Yeah,
but as a rule, brimonidine, sir, should be contraindicated in children. Because children cannot have any kind of neurodepression. We want neurodevelopment in them.
All right. Because drowsiness and somnolence, it can affect their school performance as well and growth as a human
right.
overall,
Absolutely.
isn't it? Okay, guys, so that's great. Now, guys, moving on to some other drugs, myotic agents, pilocarpine, physostigmine, ecothiopate, carbachol. We have a lot of them. But, sir, which is
Sir, pilocarpine. I will answer your question. Sir, only pilocarpine is used.
So, guys, pilocarpine is the only one that is clinically used nowadays. And obviously, they are myotic agents, so all of them, they will increase trabecular outflow. And pilocarpine is the drug of choice in closed angle glaucoma, which I mean to say is not for the acute phase. Acute phase, I use mannitol or estazolamide, but once I have controlled it to prevent further attack, I'll be using pilocarpine. Side effects, guys, because of ciliary muscle contraction, because of action of pilocarpine on the M3 receptors, which are GQ subtype, they increase calcium. That causes contraction of ciliary muscles, that causes your accommodation spasm. Because of that, you can have brow ache, you can have corneal edema, and you can have retinal detachment. Sometimes they do ask you MCQs questions on these.
Sir, I'd like to add one more thing here, sir.
Yeah, please.
Sir, we just now discussed that timolol causes NLD obstruction, nasolacrimal duct. There is another thing called punctal occlusion, puncta, in the eyelid, right? Both of them are kind of same because punctal occlusion or NLD obstruction both will lead to watering from the eye. But actually, punctal occlusion is a side effect of pilocarpine, but NLD is a side effect of timolol. But do we actually see punctal occlusion a lot? No, because punctal occlusion is not going to occur on, let's say, 5 days use or 10 days use. It is going to occur after chronic use. And pilocarpine, very, very, very rarely would you ever see a chronic use in a patient, because as we just now discussed in angle closure glaucoma, we will end up doing laser iridotomy rather than continue using pilocarpine, sir. But this is a point of confusion among students, so I hope all of you are noting this, sir.
Alright, guys, so the other drugs are not that important. Nevertheless, let us have a look at the side effects. Ecothiopate, guys, it causes iris cysts. And ACH inhibitors like ecothiopate, physostigmine, ACH inhibitors, they have one common side effect, that is cataract, and that is the reason why they should never be used in phakic patients. But as it is, in today's world, we don't use them at all. Now, guys, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, guys, it's not no rocket science. They decrease aqueous production. We have oral or there is systemic drugs, estazolamide, topical drugs, brinzolamide, dorzolamide. And estazolamide, as I've already said, they're used in acute congestive glaucoma. There is no doubt about this. Now, this is what I would like to confirm from you, sir. Open angle glaucoma, how commonly these drugs are used in today's world?
Sir, again, brinzolamide is used as a second line drug in terms of combination therapy along with timolol usually.
Okay.
Dorzolamide has a specific use in being useful in congenital or childhood glaucoma.
Okay.
Almost all of the cases of congenital or childhood glaucoma are managed surgically. But whatever percentage we need to maintain medically, they have to be or they are usually maintained on dorzolamide.
So, guys, dorzolamide, congenital glaucoma.
Right.
So this is one we prefer, isn't it?
Right.
So estazolamide, guys, it causes systemic side effects. Brinzolamide, dorzolamide, transient myopia, periorbital dermatitis, corneal edema. So these are usually not asked because the simple reason they're not that commonly used in adults, right? So, guys, if they ask you congenital glaucoma or in children, then we can go for dorzolamide. And the latest drug is Rho kinase inhibitor, guys. Netarsudil is a sibling of fasudil, and it increases trabecular outflow. So it relaxes the trabecular meshwork, increases the outflow, and it is used as an add-on drug in open angle glaucoma to latanoprost. So we have FDC, fixed dose combination of both these drugs as well. So if my patient is not responding only to latanoprost, previously I used to combine a timolol. Now I have an option of combining netarsudil as well. Side effect, guys, is a vasodilator. Netarsudil can cause local vasodilatation, because of which congenital hyperemia, as well as it can cause cornea verticillata or vortex keratopathy, a side effect that is seen with drugs as well, like amiodarone, chloroquine, right? So, guys, these are the anti-glaucoma drugs, and I wanted here in this session so that we both can together give you the perspective of these drugs, not only in the world of books or theory or videos, but also in the real world. I wanted to know for myself as well what it does in a clinical field, right?
So let's begin with our next clinical scenario. Scenario number 3. A healthy 60-year-old man presents with 2 days history of a painful rash over the right side of his face from the forehead extending onto the eyelid. Okay. Also, there is a vesicular skin lesion seen at the tip of the nose. Okay, guys. Which of the following therapies would be most appropriate? Again, before going on to the therapy, let's try to diagnose the condition. So as I've just told you, there is a rash on the forehead going up to the eyelid, extending on the nose up to the tip of the nose. There is a vesicular lesion. Now, if you are seeing where my hand is moving on one side of the face in the area supplied by the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. As soon as I say this, or as soon as you read this much, I hope you are able to read the diagnosis. What is the diagnosis, everybody? The diagnosis is, yes, let's see a photograph. If you've still not been able to answer, as soon as you see this photograph, see this area affected, everybody, this is a classic case of herpes zoster. Yes? Now, in herpes zoster, what is important? Important is the part that the tip of the nose has also been affected. Why? I hope all of us have read a sign called as Hutchinson's sign, guys. What does Hutchinson's sign say? That if the tip of the nose is affected in herpes zoster, then the chances of ocular involvement are almost certain. Yes, that means because the tip of the nose is affected, we can be sure, we can be certain that it is a case of herpes zoster ophthalmicus. Right, guys? We have reached the diagnosis. Now, HZO. Some important features about HZO. HZO leads to something called as pseudodendritic keratitis. Why is it called as pseudodendritic? We see a dendritic pattern, that means a branching pattern. We see it in herpes simplex virus also. But in herpes simplex virus, terminal knobs are present. Whereas in pseudodendritic keratitis, these terminal knobs are absent. Also seen is something called as nummular keratitis, which is subepithelial coin-shaped lesions. Yes? It is also prudent to remember that the least common ocular involvement in herpes zoster virus is sclerokeratitis. Herpes zoster virus can cause all the cranial nerve palsies, it can cause post-herpetic neuralgia and everything else. Now, once we know it is a case of herpes zoster virus, we need to go back to the question and then hand it over to Dr. Ranjan to be able to answer the question, guys.
So guys, as Dr. Utsav has beautifully explained that it is a case of herpes zoster. And guys, what are the options? Option A, B, C, D, topical trifluridine. Guys, though it can be used, it is not that commonly used, right? And it is not, obviously not the first preferred drug. And the topical eye drops, they are not available in India. So in India, the most commonly used drugs are the oral drugs, be it acyclovir, valacyclovir or favicyclovir. Now, which one to choose? Now, yeah, the clue lies in the doses and the dosing. Guys, famciclovir 500 milligrams is fine, but BD is not fine. It is given by TDS dosing 3 times a day. Acyclovir 800 milligrams is fine. Dosing is not fine. Not TDS, 5 times. Yes, 5 times a day. So guys, here the best answer is oral valacyclovir 1000 milligrams TDS for 10 days. If even doses are not given, in that case, still I can find an answer because the most preferred drug, right, for herpes virus, it is oral valacyclovir. The reason being it has better oral absorption as compared to acyclovir. Famciclovir is an alternative to acyclovir. It is not that commonly used. So if you look at HSV, herpes simplex virus, be it HSV or VZV, herpes simplex virus or varicella zoster virus, in these cases, the drug of choice is valacyclovir more than acyclovir because valacyclovir is a prodrug with better oral absorption. In case the patient is not responding, and obviously not responding means resistance. So resistance can be seen to acyclovir or valacyclovir because of 3 reasons. Either it is because of DNA polymerase alpha mutation, it can be because of thiamidylate kinase mutation, or it can be because of an impaired thiamidylate kinase production. 3 mechanisms. So MCQs are asked on these as well. So in case there is resistance to these drugs, then my best drugs, it becomes foscarnet. So here they can ask you an MCQ as well. What if the patient is not responding to valacyclovir? What is my next best go-to drug? Then your answer becomes foscarnet, guys. Right. So this is the treatment part, guys. Now, guys, moving on to the next question. A 64-year-old woman complained to her physician of involuntary blinking and closing of the eyes, right? And she noticed that the eyelid spasm was made worse by fatigue and anxiety. A treatment with local injections of a drug was prescribed. Which of the following is the mechanism of action of the drug? Right? A, B, C, or D. Now, before I
Sir, I am already showing them, sir.
Before
they should be able to diagnose, sir. Nothing, sir. Nothing. They should be able to diagnose, sir.
Yeah. So
can you diagnose?
Before I go into the options of mechanism of action, we need to reach to a diagnosis, which Dr. Usab is the best person to do that.
So what am I doing, guys? By now you should have been able to diagnose. There is spasm in my muscles of my eyelid. That is the key. There is spasm in the muscles of the eyelid, which is leading to involuntary blinking. I don't want to blink, but I can't control it. There is forced closure of my eyes. Why is there forced closure of my eyes? Because of spasm of the muscles. Again and again I'm saying spasm of the muscles of the eyelid. Now if we remember the medical terminology, everybody, eyelids can be referred by blepharitis. Yes, we have read this term, blepharitis. Yes. So the diagnosis becomes as simple as blepharospasm. Blepharospasm. That's your diagnosis, right? Just based on the simple facts mentioned in the question. Now, I know it is not a very common condition, but clinically, yes, it is something which can be easily diagnosed as soon as the patient is walking into your clinic. You can see the patient and you can come to a differential diagnosis at least. So let's talk about blepharospasm a little. Now, blepharospasm is involuntary. Obviously, it is sustained. That's the important point. It is not that this blepharospasm will stop after 15 minutes or 20 minutes. It keeps on continuing. That is why it becomes a cosmetic as well as a physical disability, right? And there is forcible eyelid closure. There is forcible eyelid closure due to muscle spasm. I try to open it, it again closes. I try to open it, it again closes. Yes? Now, broadly defining or dividing it, it can be of two types. Reflex to some kind of irritation. That irritation can be due to bright light. That irritation can be due to some corneal pathology or some eyelid pathology. Whenever there is any kind of irritation, the smooth interface between the cornea and eyelid is lost. It leads to some irritation, and irritation leads to reflex blepharospasm occurring over and over again. But if it is not reflex blepharospasm, and we have ruled out all neurogenic and myogenic causes which can lead to muscular spasm, then we say it is a clinical diagnosis of exclusion. Then we say there is no problem, it is essential blepharospasm or benign essential blepharospasm. This condition is usually seen in the age group 45 to 65 years of age, and it is usually bilateral, though it can be unilateral also. Now that we have been able to diagnose it as a case of essential blepharospasm, now comes the question, what should be the treatment? There is spasm of the muscles. There is contraction. We need to be able to relax the muscle. So for relaxation, what you should give everybody? For relaxation, think about it. What should you give for relaxation? Muscular relaxants. Okay, but what is the better treatment? Obviously, it has to be botulinum toxin A. Now, botulinum toxin A injections are injected into the upper eyelid, primarily into the orbicularis muscle, which leads to relaxation of the spasm. These injections are short-lived. They have to be repeated over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. How they act? This should be best explained by Dr. Ranjan to us.
So guys, Botox, how does Botox act overall? How does it relax muscles? Guys, we have discussed this in our lectures that acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter which acts upon NM subtype of receptors on your muscles, and that causes muscle contraction. Now, whenever I give Botox, what it does, it blocks release of acetylcholine. So there is no action on NM receptors, and that is the reason why muscles will relax. So they're used in muscle or musculospastic disorders like the one we have discussed in this question, blepharospasm. Other conditions where the muscles, we need to relax them, are achalasia cardia, right? Achalasia, where the LES is not relaxing, will inject it along the LES, so it relaxes. Dystonia, involuntary muscle contraction. The particular muscle responsible for dystonia, we can inject it there. Cosmetic purpose, guys. What we can do is to remove wrinkles. We can inject it, right? And the wrinkles are gone. This is the reason why you can see a lot of superstars in your big screen as of now as well. The reason being is Botox. And another important use is migraine. So guys, all conditions, the mechanism is a decrease in release of acetylcholine except migraine. Guys, migraine, the mechanism is a decrease in release of CGRP or calcitonin gene related peptide, and that is the reason why it is used for prophylaxis of migraine, right guys? Another important aspect is Botox is, guys, the effect is not permanent. That means the patient has to come to you, right, time and again to get these injections of Botox. So Dr. Usab, in your clinical practice, how frequently patient has to visit to you?
Sir, usually we see that repeated injections are needed over 3 to 4 months periods.
All right. So every 3 to 4 months, guys, we need repeated injections. And since you are injecting this, I mean, I'm pretty sure that we will not be able to limit the drug to a particular muscle. So it must diffuse out to some other muscles. So are there some side effects related to
Absolutely,
this?
sir. Based on what you have said, when we are trying to inject the drug into the orbicularis muscle, we need to be aware of the anatomical structure surrounding it.
All right.
Because some of the Botox drug will diffuse into some of the surrounding structures for sure. So now what are the surrounding structures? Surrounding the orbicularis, we have LPS, levator palpebrae superioris. So if Botox diffuses into LPS, then LPS will not be able to act. The action of LPS is elevation of upper eyelid. So instead of elevation, what will occur is permanent drooping, and we get to know it by the name of ptosis of the eyelid due to LPS. Instead of LPS, the Botox can also diffuse if improperly given into frontalis muscle. Frontalis pulls our forehead up, and with that our eyebrow up. So if frontalis is paralyzed, it will lead to ptosis, but of the eyebrow. So eyebrow ptosis. This is the most common side effect, ptosis. Now, what can also occur related to this ptosis is something called as Spock eyebrow. If we have seen the films or the movies or the series where Spock is a character, we know that Spock's eyebrows are like this. Laterally, they are raised up, medially, they are down. Now, what happens is, more commonly, the botulinum toxin will diffuse into the medial part of frontalis rather than the whole frontalis. So, whenever it is diffusing into the medial part of the frontalis, the medial brow is getting ptosis, but the lateral brow is raised up. So, you will get this slanting brow, and this is called as Spock eyebrow. Am I clear? Now, another important side effect, sir, can be diplopia, double vision. Diplopia can be there especially, or more commonly I can say, if it is injected into the lower eyelid. Why? Because inferior oblique muscle travels along the floor of the orbit. It is very near or nearly related to the inferior eyelid. So if the Botox diffuses into the inferior oblique muscle will become temporarily paralyzed, and due to that it will not be able to act, and diplopia will be seen in the direction of its action. So this is just the basic things that we need to be aware of and inform the patient beforehand about that these are the certain side effects that we can expect when we are treating your blepharospasm.
All right. So medical legal cases are also a part of life of clinicians nowadays.
Sir, every day, sir.
And you need to explain these because these are pretty serious side effects. So you need to explain them that these are the risks they have to carry.
Sir, we have to get signed thousands of forms with every patient, sir. Unless you do that, you are not safe, sir.
All right, great. So, guys, moving on to our next question. I am a 44-year-old woman complained to her physician of hazy vision, redness, severe pain in both eyes. Right. So this is a triad of symptoms, right, in both eyes. An ophthalmoscopic evaluation or diagnosis was made, and a local drug treatment was prescribed. Which of the following drugs would be appropriate for the patient's disease? Guys, before we move on to drug, I'd like Usab sir to tell us, what are the possible diagnoses in this condition?
So, sir, the diagnosis I will ask the students. This is a very easy question, right? No complicated information given. No ABC, XYZ given. No false information given. Simple, straight question. As sir said, triad given. Hazy vision, redness, and severe pain in both the eyes. Now, pain, redness, and hazy vision. As soon as we hear these three words, what are the differential diagnoses we think of? Think about it. There is nothing else given. So we are basically talking about an acute red eye. So what is the differential diagnosis of a red eye? Let's see if you don't know this. Now, a red eye can be read in this form. A red eye which is severely painful, or which is painless or has mild pain. So if it is painful red eye, there can only be two differential diagnoses more commonly. One of them is acute angle closure glaucoma, everybody, yes, severe pain in the eye along with redness, as well as anterior uveitis, again, pain, redness, loss of vision, itis. Itis means inflammation, inflammation means these three words, yes. So as soon as I talk about these two diagnoses, nothing else is given in the question, I know, but I'm asking you, if I have two differential diagnoses, acute angle closure glaucoma and anterior uveitis, what is the first thing you will like to do to be able to differentiate? What is the sign? If you're saying KPs, no. KPs will not differentiate, no. I'm asking you, you are an intern, you are a third year. What will you do? Think about it. You know how to use a torch, yes? So on torch, what can we see, everybody? We can see our pupil. Now that is the classic differentiation factor between these two conditions. In anterior uveitis, we know that the pupil is constricted, there is meiosis. Whereas in angle closure glaucoma, what do we see? A classic pupil, which we learn as, everybody, I hope you are saying it along with me, vertically oval, mid dilated and fixed. And as you can imagine, as soon as I put a torchlight onto the eye, I will be able to differentiate between a constricted pupil and a mid dilated pupil very easily. Okay. But what if it is a painless case or mild pain? So if it is subacute case of anterior uveitis, it can be red eye in painless also, or more commonly, it can be conjunctivitis. So basically, if we understand, red eye can have three main differential diagnoses. One is conjunctivitis, one is anterior uveitis, and the angle closure glaucoma. As is written here, keratitis can be there, but not very common. Okay. Now the question comes, what is the diagnosis in the question? Let's see, everybody. In the question, it is only written that it is a 44-year-old woman with hazy vision, redness, and severe pain. No other feature is given. That means the question is easy because it is only giving you a little information. But because of the same reason, it is difficult also because it is not giving you enough information to be able to reach a conclusive diagnosis. Then how do we answer this question? Let's see. Dr. Ranjan.
So guys, here, the question is not giving away the answer. So we need to look at the options A, B, C, and D. And let us begin with conjunctivitis, guys, one of the differential diagnoses. If conjunctivitis would have been the answer, is an infection, there would have been at least one antibiotic in the options. So I've ruled out it is not conjunctivitis. Now coming to uveitis and acute congestive glaucoma. Had it been a case of acute congestive glaucoma, I would have started with a drug like mannitol or acetazolamide, and not with drugs like apraclonidine. Ephedrine has nothing to do here, or even timolol latanoprost, which can be used in the later stages of acute congestive glaucoma, but not in the beginning, right? So these two are out, guys. And now we're remaining with anterior uveitis. What is our aim in anterior uveitis, guys? There is severe pain, right? To relieve that pain, what I need to do is I need to paralyze your muscles of accommodation, right? That means I need to achieve cycloplegia. That is one. Now remember here, NSAIDs, they do not have much role as far as analgesia is concerned. So analgesic effect, to get cycloplegia, I use atropine. Second, I need to get rid of inflammation. For that, I need to use steroids like dexamethasone. So option D is the best possible answer here, guys. Now remember, atropine, it has two uses, which I've told you in my lectures as well. That one, it produces cycloplegia, decreases pain, right? Second, it will prevent posterior synecdoche formation between the iris and the lens because it keeps the pupil moving, right? Because of which synecdoche formation, the chances are lesser. So guys, that's the answer here. Answer is option D. Now guys, next question I'd like Dr. Usop to take over.
Okay guys, so let's start with the next clinical scenario. A 15-day-old baby, 15-day, that's the first clue. So we are talking about a neonate here, right guys? A 15-day-old baby boy was admitted to the pediatric department, obviously, with findings as seen in the image. So let's look at the image. In the image, what can we see? What can you see, everybody? The most evident thing is we can see a lot of sticky discharge coming out of the neonate's eye. The second thing that we can see is that there is certain swelling of eyelids, right? So I made the question a little easier for you. I have described the image. So it is a neonate having discharge and swelling of lids. The diagnosis should be forming in your mind already, I hope. A gram stain of the exudate revealed no microorganisms, inconclusive, no problem. But a GEMSA stain, when done, showed cytoplasmic inclusions, intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies. Yes, both topical and systemic treatments were prescribed. Which of the following drugs was most likely administered? So again, the treatment is being asked, but first of all, we need to know the diagnosis. A neonate having discharge can only be one diagnosis, guys. What is that diagnosis? Yes, I know all of you have already answered it. I know everybody. Ophthalmia neonatorum. Right, guys? So that's my diagnosis. But as we all of know that ophthalmia neonatorum can have different causes based on the onset after birth in terms of the number of days or the number of hours. Yes. So if we don't remember it, let us revise through this table, everybody. So we know that the earliest can be within first 6 hours of birth, which is called as chemical conjunctivitis. This was This was, I am saying everybody, common when silver nitrate used to be used as a method of prophylaxis. Creed's method, everybody. But nowadays, Creed's method is obsolete. We don't use it anymore. So the incidence of chemical conjunctivitis has decreased. Then, if the onset is 24 to 48 hours after birth, then it is usually infected by Neisseria gonorrhoeae, which is the most severe form of ophthalmia neonatum. If it is 2 to 5 days, then the answer is other bacteria. Other bacteria means apart from Neisseria. If the onset is 5 to 7 days, then we have herpes simplex virus as the cause. And then let's come to the most common cause. After 1 week, 15 days is asked in the question. That means we fall in this category. And the answer is Chlamydia trachomatis serovars D2K. So that means we have been able to reach a diagnosis very simply that 15-day-old neonates or ophthalmia neonatum caused by Chlamydia trachomatis. So now the question is on the treatment, which is best explained by Dr.
So guys, as you can see, this question is a simple one. The duration has given away the answer. Inclusion bodies, they have given away the answer. That is Chlamydia trachomatis. And two classes of drugs are quite commonly preferred for treatment of chlamydia. One is the tetracycline group of drugs, and the second one is the macrolides. But since it is a kid, what do you think? Can we use tetracyclines, guys? No, right? Because tetracyclines, they hamper bone growth, which is pretty much required in a newborn baby and in growing children as well. So here, the tetracycline group of drugs, though the best one, we cannot use it. So guys, in kids and in pregnancy, we go for erythromycin, right? As an antibiotic, we do not use tetracycline or doxy. And erythromycin syrup would be used, guys, 50 milligrams per kilograms. We divide it into 4 doses, right? The total dose, and 4 times a day. We give this, and the total duration is 14 days. In case there are different causes, like Neisseria gonorrhoeae is the cause, then the drug of choice for gonorrhea is ceftriaxone, guys. For other bacteria, we'll be using antibiotics based upon susceptibility. Herpes virus, acyclovir, is the drug that is the go-to drug for us, as all of you know. Right, guys? So here, if you look at the options, then obviously tetra and erythro both are in the options, guys. But our best answer here, it has to be erythromycin. Right, guys? Now moving on, guys. Now we have moved on to the last question of today's session. As beauty of a question, guys. A 23-year-old woman with AIDS came to the clinic complaining of floating spots in her vision and difficulty in reading. Fundoscopic examination revealed the following signs in the image. The patient did not respond to the first-line drug. What could be the mechanism of resistance? So guys, fundoscopic examination, it is not my department.
Thank you, sir. So even though the question says floating spots in her vision and difficulty in reading, do we really want to focus on the symptoms given in the question? No. I would rather focus on the one word that will help me diagnose. Again, as I said, we need to be Sherlock Holmes. We need to be able to see. So the question is on a patient of AIDS, HIV. So we are talking about HIV disease in the eye, HIV retinopathy. Yes. In HIV retinopathy, you should be able to remember certain points, the very less number of points anyways. And then when we look at the fundoscopic examination, what are we able to see? Are we able to see any problem in the optic disc whatsoever? No, absolutely clean and clear. Yes. The problem actually lies in the peripheral retina. In the peripheral retina, if I talk in simple words, there are two colors or two colored lesions seen. One is a red colored lesion and another is a white colored lesion. If I draw the outline of the lesion, I am able to draw this shape. What kind of a shape does it remind you of? Does it remind you of a pizza? Yes, it should. As soon as I say a pizza, are you able to diagnose this? So what are we seeing? We are seeing retinal hemorrhages, right? Going centripetally along the blood vessels, along with some yellowish white fluffy lesions in the center. So two types of lesion arranged in the form of a pizza pie, I can say. And that is why this lesion is classically known as pizza pie, or we call it sauce and cheese, red and white, sauce and cheese appearance. As soon as we see this photograph, as soon as we hear the word AIDS, and we should be able to see that the diagnosis has to be cytomegalovirus retinitis because it is the most common opportunistic infection in AIDS, especially when the CD4 count becomes less than 50 cells per microliter. We also know it is the most common cause of visual morbidity in HIV. Yes, all these are pretty simple questions. What we should also remember about CMV retinitis is the fact is it can lead to a complication and a serious complication at that, and that is rhegmatogenous retinal detachment, specifically if greater than 25% of my retina is involved. Yes. So the question could have been solved just based on the word AIDS if you have ever read it. Now that we know the diagnosis, we will hand it over to sir to be able to explain us the treatment part.
So guys, here we are talking about a case of CMV retinitis, and all of you know that the drug of choice for CMV, cytomegalovirus, is ganciclovir or velaganciclovir. Both can be used. More preferred is velaganciclovir. Mechanism of action, guys, is similar to acyclovir, block of DNA polymerase alpha, thiamidylate kinase. Mechanism of resistance is a little bit different. Just like acyclovir, we have DNA polymerase alpha mutation, but we don't have thiamidylate kinase mutation. Third point here, what we have is a decreased phosphorylation, which is not present with acyclovir. So these are two mechanisms of resistance. And another one common thing they ask you is side effect of ganciclovir, dose limiting side effect, it is bone marrow suppression. Now looking at these, let us go back to our question, guys. The patient did not respond to the first line drug. So the first line drug is obviously ganciclovir, right? What could be the mechanism of resistance? Is it RNA polymerase mutation? No, guys. Is it DNA polymerase mutation? Yes, it can be a mechanism. Is it thiamidylate kinase mutation? No, because it is seen with acyclovir. Is it increased intracellular phosphorylation? No, because it is not increased, rather it is decreased intracellular phosphorylation. So guys, the best answer is DNA polymerase mutation. Now guys, moving away a little bit from this question, see the patient is on ART, antiretroviral therapy. So Usab sir, whenever we give ART, do they have any kind of specific ocular side effects?
Surprisingly, yes, sir. We would think that we are giving ART, we are treating actually HIV. Why would the treatment have any specific ocular side effects? But it is based on a very simple fundamental. The side effect, which has been asked previously as a question, is known as IRU. If you know the full form of IRU, I hope you will be able to think it yourself. The full form is immune recovery uveitis. Immune recovery. So what is happening, guys, understand? When we are giving antiretroviral therapy, we are actually treating immunosuppression, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So there is immunosuppression. So when ART is acting, it is raising the CD4 count because the immunity is coming back. When the CD4 counts are increasing, when the immunity is coming back, the immunity is mounting a reaction against the CMV antigens present in my eye. When CMV retinitis actually occurred, the CD4 counts were very low, less than 50. So there was no inflammation or no reaction mounted to CMV antigens. But now with the immunity coming back, immune recovery, inflammation is being mounted, which is presenting as uveitis, either anterior or intermediate, or as cystoid macular edema. So we are saying as a side effect of antiretroviral therapy, we are landing up with a complication, which is immune recovery uveitis. As simple as that.
So Dr. Utsav has beautifully explained, guys, how it is a case of CMV retinitis, what can be seen, and what is IRU as well, which many students must be having doubts, right? So I do get this as a doubt as well. So today we have tried to clear this part as well. So guys, this is what we had planned for you guys today, a combination of pharmacology and ophthalmology and integration at the level of clinics. And this is what, guys, we always try in Mero, to give you something better, to give you something extra, so that you are ahead in the race. And we also toil day in and day out so that these interesting cases can be brought to you. And with the changing scenario in your course as well as your exam, which is going to happen, right? So we always try that you are always a step ahead. And there is a reason why we are bringing this integration between the clinical and preclinical, as well as we'll be bringing integration at the level of different preclinical subjects as well.
Thank you, sir. I hope the students have been able to learn something from both of us. I certainly have been able to learn a lot from you, sir. We used to do a lot of treatment, but the nitty-gritties of the treatment, why we are doing it, we have actually forgotten, sir. But that is all what these clinical integration videos are about. Yes. We need to be able to have a broad mind. We need to be able to think like doctors. This is the need of the hour. This is the key to the lock that you need to open in pre-PG and as brilliant doctors later on. There are various videos on different integration subjects by faculties like us and other faculties on Mero. I hope all of you students are able to listen to those videos and learn from those videos and shape your mind in the correct direction. As always, if any of you have any doubts, any clinical scenarios, please feel free to ask us or approach us in any way whatsoever possible. Thank you, Dr. Ranjan, for this beautiful session.
Thanks a lot, sir, for enlightening me with some knowledge of ophthalmology. So, I mean, we see with our eyes daily, but, looking into the eye is quite a difficult subject. And guys, I hope you guys will be benefited much from this session. Lots of love and blessings from both of us. This is Dr. Ranjan and Dr. Utsav, Clinical Integration in Mero.